if you had to pick the playstyle that was most common and emblematic of what Advance is, it's TSS. And this is arguably because it is the best. So the reason why it is considered as such, and no matter what you think about the playstyle yourself, what cannot be denied is that when it comes down to crunch time and you're at the highest level of play and you've got a game that you really need to win, or a series of games, then the TSS teams start coming out a lot, because you really need to control as much as possible. And that is the beauty of having Toxic, Sandstorm, and Spikes on your side. That's what TSS is. So you're thinking, okay, well, Toxic, Sandstorm, Spikes, those are all passive forms of damage. So is this not just stall? And that is the thing. The more extreme ends of the spectrum, I hesitate to call them extreme because even stall and offense and advance generally don't tend to be risky in the same way that full stall or setup spam hyper offense might be in a later generation. But they each have their own issues. Offense doesn't have as much of a backbone and can struggle against other offensive threats. Whereas defensive teams, they struggle against more aggressive forms of play, whether direct or indirect, because they are generally on the slower side, more reactive, more passive. So with TSS teams, there is a lot of variety, which is why it's not necessarily a bad thing to bring a TSS team even when everyone's expecting it, because there's so much to be done under that TSS umbrella while still remaining not just viable, but top tier. And unpredictable for that matter. So in the sample teams thread for Advance that we have on the screen now, we see that there are 3 different kinds of TSS teams. The balanced ones, which are the most common, then there are the more offensive ones, and then there are the more defensive ones. So even before we get into the detail, you see the variety inherent in what you can do here. However, what separates even the defensive TSS teams from their harder stall counterparts is that they are still going to take on a more aggressive play style than your average stall team. And this is largely because of the limiting presence of Sandstorm. Now, because Sandstorm is a great tool for pressuring the opponent, but it does also limit your own Pokemon. So that is the strength of TSS, that you balance great defensive capabilities when you've got defensive cores, Skarm, Pert, Bliss, but you also have offense. And this really gives you the best of both worlds because the goal is always to be like Hannah Montana. So you've got the defensive core to ward off offensive threats very well, much better than a standard offensive team is going to be. However, you don't go the full stall route because as good as your defenses might be, you might still crumble under pressure, not just from direct offensive threats like a cascading chain of Mence, Gara, DD-Tar, but also just from continued pressure from an opposing Spikes team, the most common example. So to guard against this, then you have offense of your own. And it is much more difficult to break through a defensive core that is backed up by offensive threats. So let's say, I've finally broken through, and this is not just an Advance thing, this is present in all sorts of generations. It's why this general play style, the balanced Spikes with the offensive threats, it's why it's so prevalent in other gens. I mean, what else is Alakazam Spikes in gens 5 through 7, as one example. So yeah, you're breaking through that defensive core finally. I've broken through that Blissey, that Skarm, and then they whip out the fast offensive threat and clean you up because, you're focusing all your resources on breaking through the defense, and when you've got a full-on offensive team, you are not going to have as much of a backbone. Obviously, Advance is a bulky enough generation to where you're generally going to have a pretty good backbone with most teams, but not exactly the kind that is going to be very well off against something like Starmie or Aerodactyl in the late game. So that kind of flexibility is what makes it so appealing in high-level play, because you've got the defensive core for stability in the face of opposing threats, and then you've got the flexibility to go on the offensive and put more immediate direct pressure on the opponent, especially in conjunction with those Sandstorm and Spikes, which makes something like Arrow a lot scarier. Without those, then Suicune will eat up Aerodactyl all day long. With those in play, then Suicune is adamantly refusing to switch into Aerodactyl. Haha, adamant joke. Anyway, so this is why they are so great and so spammed, and as much as occasionally people go like, oh, they're not even that good anymore, and that just repeatedly turns out to be untrue. So the reason why this is not full stall is because of that offensive lean to them. Even the more defensive TSS teams, they will have some speed and are played more aggressively, whereas the stall teams, the really hardcore ones, they tend to avoid sand because they want to bolster things like Suicune or Milotic to their fullest capabilities. Not that Suicune or Milotic cannot be used on such teams, of course they can, but the play style is different. With TSS, you are trying to lock your opponent down as quickly as possible. And with stall, then you're kind of trying to sit back and drag it out more. This does not mean slow the game down to make your opponent frustrated or any of that stuff that people who don't know what they're talking about think stall is. Oh, just wasting other people's time. No, it's not like that. It's slowing the game down to where you can control the pace. With TSS teams, you obviously have this option on the more balanced and defensive ones anyway, but you also are not trying to slow the game down and just let the opponent wear themselves out, unless their team is so vulnerable to the passive damage that you can just do that. I mean, if that presents itself as a viable the case for your opponent, then I mean, if their team can't break the defensive core, that's on them. So that's why it's so reliable. Against teams that are just going to let themselves get worn out, you will do that safely, and you have a very high percentage of winning. And in games where the opponent isn't going to be worn down so naturally, then you take these same elements that are going to put any team on a timer, and you combine them with your offensive threat to really create this kind of pincer movement, where you are going to lock the game into that state for your cleaner, whether it's Gengar or Moltres, whatever it is, to finish things off. So, yeah, the primary elements here are the Sandstorm and Spikes. And again, I have to emphasize Sandstorm. But Sandstorm and Spikes, because they're so automatic and hit pretty much everything, whereas Toxic, you obviously have to aim at specific Pokemon. And that is why sometimes you will have something like a TSS team that doesn't actually have Toxic, so, but it still plays like a TSS team. You can date this back to the old Superman teams used by players like G80, and he had a post where I remember he said, oh, well, Skarmory used to have Toxic, and then I changed it to Rest Talk, because this is a long time ago when Sleep Talk worked differently. So, yeah, that's how ancient that was. So he said, yeah, this technically isn't a TSS team anymore, but even though it's not a TSS team in the literal sense, it still plays like one, because it has that same blend of the defensive core and the offensive threat to clean the opponent up late game. So, across the generations, like even in something like GSC, the best defensive teams are generally the ones that play with a more aggressive bent to their style. So that is why they're so consistent and why hardcore stall teams are so risky. And you see echoes of this play style in every generation pretty much. So yeah, we've got the different kind. I mean, the possibilities are endless, of course. And you see that Toxicless slash. That's why the category in the offensive TSS teams is also slash Spikes offense, because the Spikes offense is offensive, not always going to have room for Spikes, but it is very aggressively using both Sand and Spikes to do it. And you can still have Toxic on an offensive Spikes team. The standard here is the ladder team made famous by Kurtz, and his team, it's got a CB Metagross, Starmie, Jolteon. It is screamingly fast, but so there's no room for Spikes there, or for Toxic there. But there are several variants of offensive TSS teams. I mean, Jolteon can use TSS. You can run a Toxic Swampert, whatever you want it to be. I'm sure you could run Toxic T-Tar in such teams, which is a great set, incidentally. So that's why the offensive TSS teams tend to be more. I mean, not all of them are as fast as Kurtz is, which is very fast, but also on the frailer side. So you could even take like a standard T-Tar Skarmory Blissey, Gengar, Aerodactyl, right? Well, then that's a very balanced TSS team. But you throw an offensive Celebi in that Blissey slot, and suddenly I would consider it more offensive, because suddenly it's playing more aggressively. And that's a great team. So, again, don't get too caught up on the labels. You know, it's generally the mindset. Now, the defensive TSS teams, I mean, even these you see here, as this Asta team with the Calm Mind Leech Celebi alongside Dugtrio. I mean, this is still a slower paced team, but with the speed of the Dugtrio, you'll notice that all three of these defensive TSS teams have a Dugtrio. Dug is not necessarily is not a necessity on defensive TSS, but the reason why it's generally used is because these teams try to slow the game down more, and then Dug is more forceful in removing the threats. So, I mean, it's all about playing aggressively and limiting the window your opponent has to break through you. And Dugtrio excels at that. But again, it could still be something like Aerodactyl, which is, you know, one of the most famed cleaners on the style. Across all three, balanced, offensive, whatever it is. You know, like this style of team that was popular a long time ago, you know, Jolteon and Arrow. You just have the two fastest Pokemon in the tier, and both of them are really good at cleaning up. So that kind of thing is the same idea. You know, even when you're going slower with the defensive TSS, like Asta team has a bulky Zapdos and a lot of healing, but it's still not trying to... Its go-to game is not just stall the opponent out. And the ability to switch tempo and go more aggressive, that in-game flexibility is why it's so favored by top players in important games, because when you are in these kinds of situations, you don't want to leave things up to the matchup and just kind of be helpless and, you know, trying to keep up, flailing haplessly. What you want is to be able to dictate the game, dictate some sort of terms of your own. You know, put some sort of actual direct pressure on the opponent. And, you know, these pure stall teams, if they're falling behind, then there's very little they can do to make up the ground. It's not impossible. No, I'm not saying that at all. It's not even unreasonably difficult or anything. But just by virtue of not having such big offensive threats, then they are much less able to. You know, and by big offensive threats, again, I don't necessarily mean that Banded Arrow or that Overheat Moltres or whatever it is. You know, Moltres can be substituted out for Charizard if you want extra speed, of course. But I mean just more like to take the Asta team again. You know, this has a very direct win path in the Celebi Dugtrio combination alongside Spikes. So being able to flip that and go more aggressive, even with these more defensively leaning teams, is a big part of why they are so successful. So I think that's kind of it. This is not a point that needs to be belabored too much, but I wanted to make it for the benefit of new players. So yeah, TSS, as long as you've got that Tyranitar and those Spikes teams, then yeah. If you're thinking, oh, well, what about Skarmory, which is now challenging T-Tar as the #1 Pokemon in the game, and, you know, now you've got these Spikes teams without T-Tar, are those necessarily super defensive? Good question. No, they're not necessarily super defensive in the realm of, you know, I keep going back to defensive Suicune, but that is the scariest Pokemon in the game with no sand. So it's not, you know, trying to stall the game out. Those teams, you know, they can still run things like Salamence and Zapdos and Gengar and Moltres or Charizard, but those are more flexible in the sense of if there's no sand, then you take advantage of that with something like increased survivability on Zapdos. And the fact is, they are still an honorable TSS team, an honorary TSS team, I should say. Still an honorary TSS team in that they still enjoy the presence of sand because it gives something like Salamence greater pressure in breaking through something like Milotic or Suicune or defensive Zapdos. So you've got that, or a Blissey, of course, with Brick Break. So they are geared to play in sand and abuse the sand. They just don't want to bring the sand themselves with the T-Tar because they want to bring something else. So they're still, you know how previously we talked about TSS teams without the Toxic because you just couldn't fit it in for one reason or another. You know, maybe you've got a Gengar Moltres team and you're more focused on spreading Will-O-Wisp. So you've got BSS, Burn, Sandstorm, Spikes, coined it here first. Then, okay, in that situation, sure. So these SCARM teams that are more offensive, then those are like TSS teams without the S, or without one of the S's, I should say. So it all starts to blend together. Don't get too caught up in the definitions. Just stick with the general idea of why you like it, and or why it's good, I should say. And yeah, then from there you can experiment and mix and match. Maybe you don't need that T-Tar after all. Just be careful of Suicune. That's why so many of those Tarless teams run Zapdos. So for the more direct Suicune answer. Not that you have to, you can do all sorts of other things. But yeah. So that is basically it. I am happy to answer any questions. But yeah, so the more offensive, I think there should be more offensive TSS/Spikes offense teams here, like the variant with Celebi I mentioned earlier. But yeah, this is a good starting point for new players, I hope. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I'll see you in the next one.